Welcome to the City Current Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're always honored to bring you inspiring stories of individuals and organizations making a difference, empowering the good in our community, and also, too, sharing stories of massive significance. We're talking about the Memphis 13. We're joined by Dwania Kyles, Memphis 13 alum, and the eldest daughter of the late Reverend Samuel Billy Kyles and Gwendolyn Kyles. Her father was on the balcony with Dr. King. Dwania is a co-founder of the Memphis 13 Foundation, and we're also joined by another co-founder of the Memphis 13 Foundation, Dwania Kyles, University of Memphis law professor and director of the Memphis 13 documentary. So we're going to be talking about the Memphis 13 story, the documentary, the foundation, and so much more. Let's start out. How are you two doing?
Great. Just happy to be here to share the story and pass it on.
Yes, doing great. Thank you.
It is a powerful story, obviously one not just for the Mid-South, but nationally and internationally too. And so this is a very important topic. Dwania, let's start with you. Give us a little bit of context because October 3rd, 1961, very important date, but obviously this is a personal storyline for you. So give us a little bit of that storyline so that we can step into your shoes, so to speak, especially in 1961.
Thank you for the opportunity to share. October 3rd, 2021 marks the 60th year that this event happened in Memphis back in 1961, where I was one of 13 Negro children, as we were called then, 5 and 6 year olds that were going into first grade to start the desegregation process in Memphis, Tennessee, in answer to Brown versus Board of Education. Took Memphis a little time to get on board with the verdict, but it happened. It was 13 of us. We went to 4 different schools. 3 of us went to Bruce. I think 4 went to Gordon. 2 went to, I think, Springdale, and the other 3 or so went to Roselle. So imagine taking your child to school for the first day, just regularly. However, we were going to all white schools on our first day of schools, which was a completely different experience, but it ushered in the way we would live in Memphis up until now, because it was one of the greatest events that happened as far as desegregation in the Jim Crow South, definitely put forward. So it was, and it was a long time before I realized how traumatic of an experience it was. As a child, I don't think so much, because my parents were so good at checking in with me, and my siblings followed me, I believe, the next year. So they were so good at checking in with us every day. How was your day? How did it go? What did the teacher do? So on, so on, so on, you know. But it's quite interesting when you get the 10 or 11 of us together and we share the stories, because even though the story actions may be different, the feeling was the same. You know, you're scared that first day just because you're going to school. So now that fear level is taken up to another, you know, another level altogether. I love what we lost one of our alums last year before last, Clarence Williams, and he was like, it was like being in the lion's den. I since have felt it was like being in the lion's mouth, you know, not just in the lion's den, in the lion's mouth, you know. I was, of the 13, I literally went from Bruce to Bellevue, which was across the street, to Central, and ended up graduating from Central. I believe that by the time, I think Sharon and Sheila say, by the time they were in the 5th grade, they were at Roselle, right? And Roselle at that point was 80% Black and 20% white. And other than them, I believe most of the other of the 13 ended up going back to predominantly Black schools or Black schools by the time they got to middle school or so, or what we call junior high back in those days, junior high school. So it was it was the experience that has defined my life and who I am as a human being.
You and I were talking before we hit record on this interview about a tour we took in the past, a cityCURRENT tour of Bruce Elementary. And the principal at the time, Dr. Archie Moss, who's a mutual friend of ours, was sharing the importance of being able to honor the past, the legacy of Bruce Elementary, the Bruce 3, the Memphis 13, so that students could use the lens of the past to better understand the future. And so having an ongoing dialogue, a beautiful mural, all of these things, how important they are for the past, but the present and the future as well. So how do you take all of the traumatic experiences that you went through as a child, and not just for you personally, but for the Memphis 13, and you consider that, I know some of them have said they've forgot their own name because they were called such dirty, nasty names. How do you take those traumatic moments and transform them and mold them in a positive way so that we can learn from them with love and understanding for the future?
The way we parlay that into healing, first of all, I have to work on healing. So and that was the beauty of the documentary. The documentary gave us the opportunity to actually start talking about it. So we had to talk about it first. And then each time we get together, the alum, the Memphis 13 alum, when we get together and hear each other's story, that's healing. You mentioned Dr. Archie Moss earlier, former principal of Bruce. One of the most healing moments, was going into that school and seeing murals and not expecting that, because, somebody says mural, you feel like it's the size of the background right here, but they were so much larger than life. No idea. That is healing, to walk into a school where I was afraid most of the time I was there, especially when I was in elementary school, to walk into the space and feel all the love that I felt. That is what the Memphis 13 alum, as well as the foundation, that's what we're interested in focusing on, moving into the future, learning from the past, because we were all in pain. We were in pain, but the parents of the children, the white children, were in pain because they didn't want these Black kids going to school with my child because of whatever, So until we're able to create spaces that are safe enough for us to come and have that conversation and for us to listen to each other, then, we're just going to be stuck.
Let's switch it over to you, Daniel. And with this, the 60th anniversary was also the 10th anniversary for the documentary, the Memphis 13 documentary. And I know that you've said that this was a crowning achievement on your end to be able to be a part of this as the director. Give us a little background on the Memphis 13 documentary and the process of putting it together, and ultimately the goal of the documentary.
So the process, I think, began for me even when I was a student here in Memphis growing up. And not that I was thinking terribly deeply about it at the time, but I went to schools that were racially integrated, at least if you looked on paper, but that were, my classrooms were not. So, I would have the school might have been racially integrated, but my classroom was predominantly white classrooms, which meant in other parts of the school, there were classrooms that were predominantly African-American students. And I don't know that I registered at the time sort of why that might be the case. I wasn't thinking that critically at that point in my life. But as I got into law school, I started to wonder, and I started to learn more about the background of Brown versus Board of Education. I started to wonder, well, I wonder what the Memphis story is. And to be honest, I assumed that there would be a lot out there because I knew a lot about the Little Rock Nine. I knew a lot about other cases that that had come up over the years that were desegregation cases. And I knew Memphis must have had a desegregation story because I knew Memphis to be a very racially diverse place and a place where these kinds of contested spaces were likely. I obviously knew the story of the sanitation workers strike, for example. And what I found was there was bits and pieces of this story that were there to be found, especially in the spaces where I would operate, which would be, in legal cases or in looking at school board minutes. That I'm not a filmmaker, although I have made a film. I'm a lawyer. I'm a law professor, and so I was looking in those spaces. And I did some writing on this, and eventually I was like, I feel like what's missing from this writing, from this research, which is all I think really important to understand the way that the law interplays with this, is to understand the lived experiences of those most directly affected. And that's what led me to sort of begin the process of reaching out to individuals. And I was lucky. I had a early grant from the Hooks Institute at the University of Memphis that sort of allowed me to begin doing this work. And it was very quick, very early in the interviews when I realized, like, these people that I was meeting were not going to tell me anything about the law side of this story. They were going to tell me all about the human experience here. And I was like, that is not going to work as like a written law review piece. These people need to be shared this story needs to be shared in a much more human way. And so from there, honestly, my goal at the beginning was to just talk to one person from each school so I could sort of check the box and say, okay, I got the experience at Roselle and at Bruce and at Gordon and at Springdale. And it was like one person led to another. And then I started to get greedy. And I was like, you know what? I think it's clear. And even listening to Dwania speak, you can hear there's commonalities to their stories, but each of these young people experienced this individually and experienced it profoundly. The commonalities are things like isolation, things like relationship with teachers, relationship with other students, but everyone experienced different levels of different things. And so my goal, getting to that part of the question, my goal with making the film was to both understand this important moment in our history, but also use their stories as like exemplars of what it takes for a person to go into a space that they're different in some way. And this is obviously historical, but I think that audiences connect to the film because this is something that continues to happen for all different types of people every day, even today. And so my hope is that the themes cause us not only to celebrate this story, because I think it's a story very much worth celebrating, but also to use lessons from these experiences to examine how we treat each other in these diverse spaces today.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about isolation, empathy, discrimination, love, compassion, mentorship, like all of these things are things, to your point, that are stories that we're dealing with now and issues we're dealing with now. And so to be able to look through the lens of what happened with Memphis 13, but to learn from it and to guide that conversation moving forward with love, as Dwania said, that then leads us to the foundation. So for you two as co-founders of the Memphis 13 Foundation, Dwania, let's switch it over to you. Talk about the mission, the goals, and the purpose, because the documentary is a big piece of this. It's a big piece of the learning experience, but obviously there's so much more to it. So Dwania, carry that conversation forward about the foundation.
So the mission statement of the foundation is to preserve and share the pioneering legacy of the Memphis 13, to spark courageous dialogue and diverse connections in our community. So we're very, very adamant about wanting to create safe space for the students, all students in Memphis, not just Shelby County, the district, private, charter, we don't care. All students to be able to come together off their campuses created in a neutral space where we can view the film and have meaningful conversations and listen to each other and learn how to speak what I like to call the language of love. Because with the foundation, we're interested in leading with our hearts, because if desegregation didn't work in 1961, and we and the schools are as segregated in 2021 as they were in 1961, well, 61 was about the law. It's not about the law now. So what is it? So we can't continue to treat it like it's about the law. So I'm sure with all the other aspects, that make it what it is, if we were to focus on love and learning what that means and how to talk to each other and how to listen to each other, because we were all traumatized by the experience that of a system that really was set up to fail. It was set up in a way to fail in the first place, to divide people more. So let us do something in terms of moving forward in the future of healing that pain. And if we focus on healing that pain, we'll start listening to each other and understand that there's not a lot of difference between us in the first place. And I'll let Daniel take it from there in terms of some of the things that we also will be focusing on.
Yeah, Daniel?
Sure. I think one thing that is important to me is to ensure that the students at all 4 of the schools get the same kind of preservation and recognition that the students at Bruce have experienced with these murals. So, and not just for the fact of the, to recognize the Memphis 13 students, but because of what it says to the students that are currently in those schools, to walk into those spaces and to see that. Another thing that I think we're working to promote here is to get our sort of Memphis 13 focused curriculum into classrooms, but not just classrooms, community groups, other organizations, to sort of share the story. But again, not just for the sake of sharing the story, but for the sake of using it as a jumping off point for dialogue, the kinds of dialogues that Dwania is describing. I think that's the point of it is yes, we want to make sure that there's recognition and knowledge about history, but really we want to trigger these courageous conversations. And then the last thing, and this is maybe just me personally, every time we share the Memphis 13 story, there's someone in the audience or there's someone who reaches out to me and says, oh, well, I was the first person to go to this middle school, or I was the first person to go to this high school, or something. So there's all these stories from our history that are out there, where I was a white student in this school, and this is what it was like for me. And so I would like to sort of use the foundation as a sort of way of capturing more of those stories, letting us see that this is not, yes, the Memphis 13 happened and it was hugely impactful and important, but that these stories are all around us, and sort of sharing those as well.
The last question is probably the easiest one. And this is one of those that we'll have to have you come back often. And I'm even thinking, Dwania, we'll do a Changemakers podcast. We can dive in 45 minutes, even longer. There's so much to this to unpack and so much relevance. But talk about website. Where do we go to learn more? Where do we go to get involved?
Website is thememphis13.com. And the Facebook is the Memphis 13. Right, Daniel? Just the Memphis.
I think it's called the Memphis 13 documentary. But yes.
Yeah. But when you go to it, I think it doesn't have documentary at the end to Facebook. And those are the two we are beefing up, or we haven't released our IG yet. So we're working on Instagram right now. And it's just so exciting and so wonderful. Daniel had said, we've dealt with the past, to be in the present, to take us into the future. And that is what we're interested in doing. And I appreciate the fact that you took the time to have us on to be able to talk about that to your audience. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. No, it's an honor, and it is a very important conversation to be had. And I think it's one of those where we need to celebrate the past, like you said, be relevant for the present, but to build with love for the future. So I love everything you two are doing with the foundation, and thank you for sharing your story. So Dwania, Daniel, thank you for coming on the show. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks so much
for having us.